So, Dr. Ben Arbour, thank you so much for being with us today, man. I really appreciate you coming on and thinking enough of me to consider us to have a discussion.
Man, I'm really happy to be here. This is fun for me to have an opportunity to talk philosophy and theology and stuff with anybody. I love to do this. So thank you for the invite.
That's awesome. Yeah, so first I just wanted to get you to tell us a little bit about yourself, like your story, how you become interested in these topics, both biblical and philosophical,
Mm.
either or. Um, and also, what's your academic background, and so how does that play into your story?
Sure. Well, there's the long version and the short version. I guess the short version is that I grew up in a Christian household. We went to church on Sundays. Um, the 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 idea of I cannot remember a time in my life where I didn't believe in God, or I didn't believe that God existed as a Trinity. We confessed the Nicene Creed week in and week out growing up, so that was a kind of important foundation for me. I had what I thought was a pretty significant religious experience when I was maybe 11 or 12 at a Christian summer camp called Camp Ozark in Arkansas. And I don't know that, some of my theological beliefs about justification or being born again or getting saved, it's hard for me to say that that's what happened then, as I kind of look back on my life. But I definitely think God sort of started drawing me to himself in an important way. Throughout high school, um, I was kind of I was interested in Christianity, but I was not a very good student. I didn't study very hard. I was, I guess intelligent enough to get by, but I didn't do all the reading and was kind of lackadaisical with assignments. I didn't really appreciate studying because I don't think I had really found anything that I was really excited about studying. Sorry, my dog's barking at something. But in college, I went to Texas A&M. That's where I did my undergrad. Studied political science and thought about going to law school. That was what the original plan was. My junior year at Texas A&M, there was a campus preacher who traveled around the country just doing outdoor preaching, open air evangelism. And I was just arrested listening to him. And he was very confrontational. I couldn't say that I would endorse him today or his methods or even some of the theology that he was preaching, but for whatever reason, God used that to really get my attention. I was attending church regularly at the time, but set me on a journey to really read the Bible, and the New Testament in particular. And I was kind of confronted by the fact that I was playing games with God. And I kind of had a very, very significant series of religious experiences then, that I kind of look back on now and think that's when I got saved. If you appreciate that kind of language, or was born again, got right with God, and began to get really serious about my relationship with God and thinking about these kind of things, not just from the standpoint of I go to church on Sunday, but this is really important. And as a result of that, I really found that I kind of liked to study all of a sudden. I liked learning. I liked reading. Pretty significant change in my life. Those who knew me would say like I was kind of a slacker beforehand, intellectually, and pretty significant change in my life there. I was fortunate to have some friends who knew some other friends who were very serious about their faith, and was introduced kind of to a new community of believers who we're kind of more theologically robust, you might say, than what you find at a lot of your average evangelical churches. And there was a guy who was actually finishing up his master's degree at a seminary who began to disciple me and talk to me about the faith from an intellectual perspective, because I had a lot of questions, not questions of doubt, but questions more like, I've been doing this, or at least I thought I'd been doing this Christianity thing for a long time, and nobody had ever talked to me about this issue or that issue or a bunch of controversies. So anyway, I graduated from Texas A&M. I had signed a contract to go into the U.S. Army as a officer. It was a strange time in the military because 9/11 happened while I was in college, and I was able to switch over from active duty to the reserves because, well, when 9/11 happened, there were a lot of people who were in the military who really were just there so they could go to college for free. And when real conflict happened, there were not nearly as many people just signing up. So there was not as much of a need immediately for certain things. So several of us were able to switch over into the reserves. And when I graduated from A&M, I went into the banking world and did that for a couple of years. I got bored and decided to go back to school. So the guy who'd been discipling me encouraged me to pursue further studies. So I decided I'd go to seminary, and I did. I finished a Master's of Divinity at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. The MDiv degree, not a lot of people know this. It's really just a bachelor's degree in religion. It used to be called the BDiv for Bachelor's of Divinity. And it eventually changed to be the MDiv because there were a lot of ministers or people who went off to college and they got degrees in engineering or English or business or whatever, and then later in life figured out that they wanted to be ministers, and so they already had a bachelor's degree, so they didn't want to go get a second bachelor's degree. It's kind of strange how all that happened. But the MDiv is a long degree. It's 90 something hours, and the program that I went through had a lot of Greek, a lot of Hebrew, a lot of history. And I was really interested in biblical theology at the time. Biblical theology, particularly New Testament and Old Testament theology. And I guess, a lot of people know who N.T. Wright is as far as New Testament is concerned. I read a lot of his work and was very interested in some debates about the new perspective on Paul, especially some of the Reformed people who were responding to it. And Francis Watson was a guy who wrote some books that really influenced me, got me interested in the theological interpretation of Scripture. And from an Old Testament perspective, Eugene Merrill, who taught at Dallas Seminary, I took some courses with him to understand the theology of the Old Testament. So my first master's degree was pretty much focused on Greek and Hebrew and trying to understand the Bible. During that season of my life, I was trying unsuccessfully to read the Old Testament 4 times a year and read the New Testament once a month. 9 chapters a day of the New Testament, you get through the New Testament once a month. So I was reading the Bible a lot in an effort to understand it. And I'm not talking about reading it in a devotional way where you read a psalm and think about it and meditate on it a lot, or neither am I talking about the deep study, where you look at a passage from Paul and dissect it and diagram sentences and figure out, whether this is a dependent clause and all that stuff. I was just trying to familiarize myself with the content of Scripture. And really was always interested in how different ideas interacted with each other. That's always kind of the way my brains worked. I had a friend who was a little bit ahead of me in seminary who kind of encouraged me to look more about thinking about philosophical questions. And those were really the questions that I was interested in anyway. Um, Things related to the problem of evil, things related to human freedom and divine foreknowledge. Um, I was really interested in Jesus. The whole idea that Jesus was fully God and fully man at the same time. Uh, that's that's something that I just continue to marvel at. I think it's amazing. I also think it's silly that a lot of people just think that's ludicrous and not possible. Just there's lots that's been written about it, but um, the Chalcedonian definition, which was the way that Christians in the 5th century sort of understood the relationship between the divine nature and the human nature, I became fully convinced that that was right. Um, so after finishing my MDiv, I was kind of in this mode of thinking philosophically, and I decided I would do a second master's degree called a THM in philosophy of religion and ethics. Um, so that's actually probably a real master's degree, not a bachelor's degree. Was interested in philosophy and thinking more about not just intermediate, basic logic, intermediate logic, but some advanced logic, and making sure to use those tools. Giving you a really long answer here. Sorry.
No, I was
Um,
enjoying that, man. I really resonate with the not doing so well at first in school,
mm,
because in high school, middle school, high school, I was the same way. I had no interest at all. But I was interested in Christ.
yeah.
I'd say in high school, I was playing in punk rock bands and I was a skateboarder, this kind of thing. And, I would hear some people saying that Christ was, the Messiah, and then some people were saying that, it was just a religion. But whenever I actually read his words, and I heard things that Christ had said, or things the Bible says about Christ, like he said, there's no difference between Jew or Greek, male or female, free or slave. I was like, this guy is punk rock. He's just like going in, kicking over money changing tables. And like, he's saying there's no difference between men and women or different like races. And I was like, whoa. So I definitely resonate with that. Also, you said an open air preacher really reached you. I got to say, this is a big thing for me, and I don't want to necessarily get into it so much, but it's maybe it's a question for another day. I always was interested in the proper approach to, I guess, reaching non-believers, and um, you hear the fire and brimstone preachers, and you hear the William Lane Craig's, and I wonder what's the actual best way to reach people, so
Well,
but
just real quick on that,
yeah,
I don't think that we ever see Jesus encounter different people in the same way. So
sure,
when I grow up, I want to be like Jesus. So I think that it's probably not the best way to think about how to reach people as though there's some formula. And if you just do this every time, it's going to work for every person. Because Jesus didn't do that. Now, that doesn't mean, in my view, that we don't need to at least figure out what it is that we're going to say, and at least make sure to communicate the same message of the truth of the gospel. But yeah, man,
sure,
the other thing just about this, talking about, I wonder what it would have been if when you and I were in high school, if we had encountered someone like William Lane Craig, who said, well, if we had an opportunity to ask a question and somebody had told us, there's a long tradition in Christianity of thinking about these things, and maybe you check out this book or something. I wonder if the intellectual awakening that we've experienced later in life could have happened earlier, if the churches that we were going to thought that it was really important to teach us instead of just keep us entertained. I don't know.
oh, yeah, that's definitely a deep thought, and we've had some conversations about that. because like I say, sometimes somebody saying something like an open air preacher can reach you in a different way, but at the same time, then you have to find out the underlying truths, the different arguments and things that go into those ideas. So I definitely agree with you there. So I guess my next question that I would like to ask
let me
is
just put a bow tie.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
I finished the THM, and then I did some additional graduate studies at the University of Dallas, which is a Roman Catholic school, and became really interested in medieval philosophy and Roman Catholic approaches to some questions in philosophy. From there, I didn't finish that master's degree. I already had 2, thought that was good. I did my PhD work at the University of Bristol, which is in England, and became really interested in analytic theology, which it's its own conversation what exactly that is. But briefly, I think that it's a attempt, at least in the vein that I want to do analytic theology. It's an integrative approach that brings the tools of analytic philosophy to bear on proper interpretations of the scriptures in order to make sense out of the claims of various theologians. So that's kind of what I've been up to for the last 6 years or so in the analytic theology game. And I've been very fortunate to be mentored and develop relationships with people who are a lot smarter than me, who've kind of helped me learn along the way. And it's philosophy and theology are these very strange worlds where your heroes, people you look up to, become your friends. And I've just been very fortunate to be able to meet the right people at the right times. And I'm still very active in our church, and I a lot of the academic work that I understand myself to be doing, I understand it to be fundamentally in service to Jesus and his kingdom. This isn't, at least my attempt to do something strictly for the sake of whatever is going on in the academy, but ultimately, hopefully, to strengthen believers and strengthen the church. So anyway,
well, that's awesome. You had some heroes become friends, and you're paying it forward by talking to me. So I appreciate that.
I'm no hero.
Well, yeah, but I appreciate you spreading, sharing your knowledge on different topics, because we like to, I want to bounce some ideas off you and hear your responses. That way I know that, I've got a well thought out response. And so the next question I had for you is, I'd like to know, who are your favorite philosophers? And it'd be interesting to get your favorite theist philosophers, but also then maybe some of your favorite non-theists, whether that's atheist or Hindu, or I'm sorry, not Hindu, that's a theist, but atheist, or even a theist that isn't a Christian, maybe. I mean, that's up to you. Answer it as however you would like.
Okay. Favorite philosophers. Jesus, and that's not intended as a Sunday school answer. I think that Jesus is overlooked as a philosopher. I think that you can, even if you're not a Christian, you can read the Gospels and consider the things that Jesus has to say and just consider them philosophically. The dude was clearly a genius. So he would be top of the list. Saint Anselm is definitely another one of my favorite philosophers who I spent a lot of time considering his ideas. Moving forward, Spinoza was depends on who you talk to, whether he was a theist or an atheist and how they interpret his works. But he was not a Christian for sure. He was a Jewish thinker.
Schilling seemed to think that Schilling's interpretation of Spinoza that he was a panentheist, that he thought God was part of nature, but that God was more than nature. And
Yeah,
I thought that was interesting.
or that all of the universe itself is God or divine. Yeah, he had some interesting views. Moving forward a little further, I would say a couple thinkers that have really influenced me are George Berkeley, and Soren Kierkegaard. Also, I'm really fascinated by those guys. In the contemporary scene, Alvin Plantinga was just
Sure.
Bill Craig, I think very highly of Bill. He's been super kind to me. There are lots of theists who I think are doing outstanding work right now. Even lots of people who I don't necessarily agree with them on every position they take, but just very, very gifted philosophers. My own doctoral supervisor, Oliver Crisp, he does, mostly theology and philosophical theology. But Oliver, I would say that he is a philosophical theologian with the emphasis on the theology, as opposed to kind of what I understand myself to be more of a theological philosopher, where I'm a little more interested in that. From a non-believing perspective, non-Christian, non-theist, I think that there are some really, really important conversations happening. Michael Tooley, Paul Draper, Evan Fales, the usual suspects, Eric Wielenberg, Graham Oppie, Stephen Meitzen, John Schellenberg. These are the atheistic philosophers who I really think are worth paying close attention to. There are others as well. There's no way I could name everybody on either side of the camps that are doing important work, either apologetically or anti-apologetically, you might say. But I do think that there's a pretty significant difference between people who are trying to approach questions of faith or questions of God's existence academically, as opposed to those who are just trying to kind of think about them as armchair theologians or armchair atheists. So anyway,
Yeah.
there's some people.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's interesting because, I'm also a fan of Kierkegaard. He was an interesting character, man. The guy just writing under pseudonyms. And then just some of the things he said, I thought, wow, like for example, I remember he said something, I believe it was in Fear and Trembling, where he was like, everybody knows the new logic, and everybody's such a smart person, and they know all of this logic and all of these things, and I'm still stuck on the faith of Abraham. I can't even understand why, like, his faith, like, was he a knight of infinite resignation, or and he had all this thing where he's like, I can't even get past the basics. And I thought that's just so interesting that the guy is just such a stickler for things like that,
One thing that's really important to understand about Kierkegaard's work are the pseudonyms. So when he writes under a pseudonym, he adopts a posture, and he's not representing his own views. He's saying, if I was this kind of person, what would this kind of person think about these sorts of questions? And he has lots of different pseudonyms, so he's trying to get into the mindset of other people who don't necessarily agree with him on various issues, and try to understand the way that they might reason about things. So Fear and Trembling would be one that I think a lot of times gets attributed to, well, Kierkegaard thinks this. Well, no, Johannes thinks that, right? And because that's the pseudonym. So it is interesting. The guy is a super genius, and was definitely thinking in ways that are foreign to some of my own ways of approaching these questions. I think that's part of why I'm attracted to reading about him.
Yeah, and there's a great, I think it's like a 36-hour lecture series that I've been listening to for the past couple of years on Audible, and it's by Lawrence Cahoon. and he goes into it, and Kierkegaard is just such an interesting person. But another interesting thing was, you mentioned William Lane Craig. I've mentioned this to a lot of people online, that it's interesting when an atheist tells me William Lane Craig is an idiot, man. Like, why would you buy it? And I'm like, the guy's got 2 PhDs. Like, he studied time for like 11 years. I mean, like, it's just so interesting to hear somebody who's like, they didn't even finish, a college degree, and then they're like, yeah, William Lane Craig, guy's an idiot.
Yeah. So a couple things about that. I don't necessarily agree with Bill's views on everything, but he's a genius. He's super smart and has such an incredible work ethic, and he's a kind person. If he's an idiot, then I guess, what does that make me? An amoeba? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And, so I want to agree with you about that. There is something that you said that I know what you mean, and I agree with what you're driving at. But I've met plenty of people who I think are super smart, who never went to college. They don't have master's degrees or PhDs, but are very well read, or even if they're not very well read, they're super intelligent. And as soon as we get into conversations, they can kind of understand what's going on, super quick learners. So I don't want to necessarily be dismissive of anybody just because they don't have the right letters after their name or something like this.
Oh, sure. I guess go ahead.
But I have found a lot of people who are just hand-wavingly dismissive of things because they've learned the right thing to say, but they don't understand what's at work. I was debating somebody just a couple of months ago, and we were talking about the ontological argument, something I've been working on a lot. And I asked him, so what's wrong with the modal ontological argument? And he said, well, I don't think it's a successful argument. And I said, why not? And he said, well, I reject S5, which is this axiom of modal logic. And in the course of my conversation with him, it was pretty clear to me that he didn't fully understand what S5 was, or how it functioned, or what reasons we have for believing it. And I was disappointed, because this is somebody who it seemed like we weren't really interested in having a conversation to arrive at the truth and understand each other's positions as people. Like, who are you? What do you believe? Why do you think that? As much as this was just for him a chess match, that, you made this move, and so now I'm supposed to make this move in order to, protect my knight, and then you're going to capture me here, and I know because of that I'm supposed to make this other move and recapture. And I was a little sad for several reasons. First of all, I don't think that modal ontological arguments depend upon S5 for their success. So I said that to him. I said, okay, that's fine if you reject versions of the modal ontological argument that require S5, but the paper that I just put out about this doesn't. It doesn't depend on S5 in any way. So why do you reject it? There are ways that the conversation could have progressed if, instead of just trying to play chess, because I was in the middle of it and caught up in it myself, if I had just asked, well, why do you reject S5? Because I don't think that we always fully understand what's going on here. And Bill Craig does a really good job of that. He does a good job of, when you're in the middle of a debate, just asking, well, hang on a minute, let's talk about this. And you're over here talking about something else, but here are the reasons that I've given. Let's talk about that material. Well-known debate between him and Christopher Hitchens, which I think took place at Biola. I'm not certain about that, but it was just an example of Christopher Hitchens not engaging with any of the arguments that William Lane Craig put forward. And I just think it's sad that there's a lot of people who haven't really learned how to think through the material for themselves. They've instead learned okay, there's argument ABC, and argument ABC leads to some conclusion, and I reject that conclusion. So rather than really thinking through the argument, I'm just going to go read what all these people who reject it say, so that the next time somebody says, well, what do you think about argument ABC? I know the right, jujitsu moves to make in order to avoid having to actually think about it. And I think that happens a lot. And I think it happens on both sides. I think that there are apologists who do that. And I think that there are atheists who do. And
Sure.
it inhibits the ability to really think well and, become friends with people who don't necessarily share the same views that you have.
Right.
It's
Well, yeah.
something that Josh Rasmussen talks a lot about, and I think he's onto something about some of these issues. So anyway,
Yeah, definitely, and that may be a good segue because and that debate was at Biola. But let me first mention that I agree with you. I see a lot of debates where people will give some type of evidence, and the other person says, "Well, I can probably disprove that in about 5 minutes. Let me just jump on Google real quick." Like, I like it when somebody scratches their head and goes, "That's interesting. I'd like to think about that more." I think I've seen you do that in one of your debates online, where you were asked something and you said, "I'd like to think about that more before I answered," or something like that. And I thought that was being honest. And a lot of us who kind of run in the circle that I'm in on YouTube, we do prefer that to the chess match where it's like you just don't want to lose. But I guess that leads into my next point, because in that debate with William Lane Craig and um, Christopher Hitchens, as you said, they were talking past each other. It seemed like Christopher Hitchens wasn't really answering a lot of the points. They argued about the term atheism a lot, and William Lane Craig kept trying to pin him on why his definition was not compatible with agnosticism. And so I just had a debate a few days ago with Tom Jump, another YouTuber that you've debated in the past as well.
Yep.
And it was on the term atheism.
Okay.
And so basically I read the philosophical definition out of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I believe it was written by Paul Draper, and it said something like, to answer the ontological claim, there is a God, you have theism, and then atheism is defined as the negation of theism. It's defined in terms of theism, and that the A should be considered not instead of without. And I guess I just wanted to get your opinion, because my main question was, I understand inter-worldview critique where someone can take a different position and you
Right.
have to critique their worldview. But on technical terms, like atheism, where the term is defined as the negation of the claim, is it proper to take a term like that's a technical term and then use it in a non technical way?
Yeah. So there are several ways for me to understand the question that you're putting towards me. Like, is it okay to do that? Like, is it moral? Is it philosophically helpful? Is it right or wrong? Is it smart or dumb? And I understand that the new atheism as a movement has kind of wanted to understand the term atheism to not be a term that is understood ontologically, but rather epistemically. So if someone identifies as an atheist, they want to say, I am a person who does not believe in God, which is just saying I lack the belief that there is a God, which is different than saying I have the belief positively that there is no God. That is a different claim. And this is where I just think analytic philosophy can be helpful in these kinds of discussions, not because we're going to do a bunch of etymological work And I'm appreciating, I mean, by the Paul Draper, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That's definitely a very, very important place to go for kind of standard definitions of things. And Paul Draper's an atheist, so you don't have any good reason to reject his definition of atheism because it's overly influenced by some theist, right? But analytic philosophy, I just think, can be helpful because it doesn't really matter how we define this term, as long as we are very clear on what definition we're using in whatever discussion. So if I start a conversation with somebody and they say, I'm an atheist, given that we know there are different ways that term is being used, it seems wise to just say, okay, now you're identifying as an atheist. Can you tell me what that means to you? And you brought up Tom Jump. Tom Jump, he says, by atheist, I mean, what does he say? That I don't think that there are any good arguments for God. That's like his definition of atheism.
Yeah,
right?
it's so yes, he always says I'm an atheist, and by that I mean there's not any reasons or evidence for God. So what I did in my debate was I gave an inverse of that. I said, well, then I'm an atheist, and by that I mean I don't think there's any good reason to believe in atheism. But I could have just as easily said I'm a theist, and by that I mean I don't think there's any good arguments or evidence for atheism. But what I mentioned to him was if he defines it that way and I define it that way, neither one of us are given a positive claim and it leads nowhere. What do you think about that?
Well, you are making a claim about negative existentials. You're making a claim that I have surveyed to the best of my ability, and I have not encountered any things that meet this criteria, being a good argument in support of whatever. So that is a claim, but it's a claim about a negative existential rather than a claim about a positive existential.
Right. So I guess I mean on the question, the ontological question, is there a God?
Yeah. So let's talk about that for just a second, right? Because I think that it's helpful to understand the term atheist or theist in two different categories. So, for everybody thinking at home, you get your piece of paper out, you draw a line right down the middle of it. So on the left-hand column, you've got what we are going to call the ontological realm. And on the right-hand side, we're going to have the epistemic realm. Now, you've got your line that you've drawn straight up and down. We got to draw another line horizontally across the page. So now you should have 4 quadrants. And remember, on the left-hand side of the page, we're going to call that the ontological realm. And on the right-hand side, we've got the epistemic realm. The top half of the page we'll call theism. The bottom half of the page we'll call atheism. Well, there's different ways to understand what these terms mean in each of these realms, right? So on the left-hand side of your page, you've got your ontological realm. On the top left, you have theist. And understood ontologically, that is a claim that says of all the stuff that exists, we got tables and chairs and people and computers and God. Like God is among the stuff that exists. That's what it means to be a theist when you understand theism as an ontological claim, right? And below that, bottom left corner of the page, you have atheist, which is the claim ontologically understood as all the stuff that exists. If you look at all of it, God is not one of the things that exists, like lamps and telephones and automobiles. That stuff exists. God does not exist. Now, you jump over to the right-hand side of the page, and now we've got this theist and atheistic categories of understanding things epistemically, right? Now, a theist is somebody who believes in God. And an atheist is somebody who does not believe in God. Now, there are ways that you might understand how those epistemic understandings of the term could map up onto the ontological claims. If somebody says, I don't believe in God, then you would ask them, okay, so if that's just an epistemic claim, if you're just saying, I am the kind of person who does not have a belief in a God, and they want to understand that just epistemically, okay, that's fine. Then I say, okay, thank you for describing your beliefs and your own personal psychology, and but I want to ask, in the realm of what actually exists, do you think that God is one of those? Now, as soon as they say no, then now they're not just making an epistemic claim, they're making an ontological claim or a metaphysical claim. If they say yes, well, then now they're in this really strange position because they want to be understood epistemically as an atheist, but ontologically as a theist, and that just doesn't make any sense. So most people just say, I don't know, right? I don't personally believe in God, but when you ask me, is there a God? Yes or no? I don't know. I don't believe in God, but I don't know. Maybe God exists. Maybe God, they say something like that. Well, then they are ontologically not an atheist. They're ontologically agnostic. And there's this connection. They say, look, I don't believe in God, but I'm not sure. Maybe there's a God. Maybe there's not a God. I don't know, but I don't believe that there's a God. So you can understand yourself to be an agnostic when understood strictly in those epistemic grounds, but when asked the ontological question, say I'm an agnostic. And I think that that's a responsible position for non-believers to take if they want to. So the idea of defining atheism not in either of those categories, but the way that Tom does, where he wants to say, by atheist, I mean there are no good reasons to believe in God. Well, that puts you in this really strange position that, I don't know, there's lots of people who believe in God, and if you ask them, why do you believe in God? They don't really have any good reasons to believe in God. And, you might even ask them, like, well, do you think that this argument is a good reason to believe in God, or that argument? And they might even say, no, I believe in God, but I don't think that there are any good arguments for the existence of God. So here you have somebody who is a committed theist, both epistemically and ontologically, but by Tom Jump's standards still counts as an atheist. So I don't think that's a very helpful definition in terms of getting at these questions either epistemically or ontologically. But, and this is the last thing I'll say, I don't even think his definition is all that problematic as long as we're just clearly defining things at the beginning of the discussion. Okay, that's how you want to use that term. You want to use the term atheism to mean that? Okay, great. Well, I just want to be clear then that when I'll use the term atheism, I'll agree to use that definition for the sake of this conversation with you. That's fine. But there are going to be times in our conversation where I want to talk about atheism as an ontological claim. So since you want to use the term atheism in this evidential kind of way, what should we call ontological atheism? We need a name for that to make sure that we are not guilty of equivocating by using the same term with different definitions. And then we run the risk of just talking past each other and not understanding. And this is the work of analytic philosophy. We just do as best a job we can to define our terms at the forefront to make sure that we're not talking past each other. That's the goal, is effective communication. So does all that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So, and actually that's what we did. Since we were debating on the topic of the definition of atheism, I kind of held him to that for a while. But then I ended up saying, okay, so to critique your worldview in, your terms, all I can do at this point is go with what you say and then hold you to consistency. Then I showed things like, it, with your definition, Christians can be atheist, and also if you say there's no evidence for God and I say there's no evidence for atheism, that gets us nowhere. So if you were to ever encounter somebody who defines theism as there's no evidence in atheism, and you define it in the inverse for atheism, then you get nowhere. You just have both of you just go, okay. So but that is a helpful distinction, and I guess that's what I meant was, is it helpful? And so that the the chart with the left and right side, the ontological, the epistemological, that is a helpful distinction, and so I think that will bring some clarity to
So,
this topic.
yeah, just one other thing on the helpfulness thing. I don't think that it's helpful to change to take a term or a word that has an established and received, agreed upon definition in philosophical literature and then deviate from that. Because when you do that, you're deviating from standing in historic relation to the rest of the conversation that has happened using those same terms, right? And say, oh, well, when I use this term, I don't mean that. I mean this other thing. Well, okay, great. I'm glad that you mean that. But what you've just done is said that everyone who's come before you and is using those terms in a different way, that everything that they had to say about this has no bearing on anything that you have to say, because you're changing the rules of the debate. You're not using terms in the same way. So who knows whether what Kierkegaard had to say about this has anything to do with what you're saying about it, because you're not using the terms of the same definitions. You're redefining everything. And I just generally think that that can be very unhelpful if you want to understand yourself to be having the same kinds of conversations that other people who've gone before you have had. If that's not what you're trying to do and you want to just have your own conversation about your own little topic, that's fine. Like, and not just fine, that's good. We should do that. But we shouldn't mistakenly think that when we do that, we're having the same conversation that other people had about the same topic, because it is in fact a different topic. Same word, different definition, therefore not the same ideas.
Wow, that's really interesting the way you put that, because that's kind of what I did in the debate. Is I actually brought up Friedrich Nietzsche, and I brought up Albert Camus and Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre,
Yep.
and I actually said the way they were using it, like the way they understood it, they actually knew atheism has a burden, and I said a lot of others. So I said, if we're going to use your personal definition, even if I were to defeat it, that would say nothing about the way most people use it. So
Right.
it's interesting that you kind of hashed out what I said, there. And so,
Well, it
but
seems like you've just done all the hard work for me then. So,
well, here's the thing is, I actually think this might be a good segue, because we want people like that to change their minds, and we have to give, arguments and evidence to help change the minds on that. And I guess one of my next question was actually, when's the last time you changed your mind on something, and how did that impact your full model or worldview? If you get where I'm coming from with that.
yeah, okay. So right now I'm been thinking about some issues in political philosophy and immigration, and relationships between immigration and economics. And I have been in the process of changing my mind slowly about some views that I have there, because I don't think I was seeing the full ramification of the economics of immigration. So it's caused me to move in two different directions at the same time. So, I mean, that's just one example of you think about something and you think that you understand it, and then you see that there are more ramifications that are bigger than you realize, and there can be positive effects that you didn't think about. And so then it makes you go, okay, well, maybe I do need to rethink this, because the economics that I was using are super short-sighted and not thinking about long-term ramifications. Philosophically speaking, like a pretty major change of mind. It's been several years since I came to realize this, but I was, this is what my doctoral work was all around, issues related to the philosophy of time and understanding the debate about human freedom and divine foreknowledge. And I set out to kind of understand the implications of what we call Anselmian perfect being theology, as it relates to the idea of open theism, or the idea that since well, on the view of the open theists, humans have a very robust free will, and because of that free will, God doesn't know the future. And there's umpteen different versions of open theism. There's at least 7 that I've identified, and there's probably other variants beyond that. And I would say, I'm not talking about open theism as like a version of process theology. If you bring that into play, then there's lots more than 7. But I was firmly convinced for a long time that it was not possible for someone to hold on to Anselmian perfect being theology while also affirming some kind of open theism, that there's a deep-seated inconsistency there. There's an incoherence. There's a violation of the law of non-contradiction. And I have become convinced that there's probably one version of open theism, maybe 2 versions of open theism, that you could believe those things and still be fully committed to Anselmian perfect being theology. Now, I have other reasons besides that for rejecting those versions of open theism, but for a long time I thought Anselmian perfect being theology was going to be enough to do it all on its own, and I've become convinced otherwise. So I changed my mind about that, largely because I have some people who I take to be pretty close friends who are also really interested in this subject, and they don't think about it the same way I do. And you sit down and you reason and you talk to people who don't see things the same way you do, and you can come to understand their position a little bit better. So there you go. There's that.
Yeah. So the people that you've mentioned multiple times that there are people that you consider to be kind of people that can lend insight to you, and I would guess these people are academics. I'm sure not all of them are, but um, I guess so. To move on to my next question, um, I just want to get your opinion on the comparison of the internet discourse and the academic discourse. It seems to me, and I could be wrong here. This could just be my bias, but it seems to me that the academic atheists tend to stick more to the arguments and evidence, and they tend to know the theist arguments better. And just from my experience now, of course, the internet atheists seem to have more of a pulling on heartstrings approach, where they want to say things like God kills people and things like this to pull on heartstrings to try and it's almost like a politician would do. Now, I could be wrong that that's just internet atheists, but I'd like to get your opinion on the difference in discourse between the internet and the academic.
Okay, so this might be another place where we need a piece of paper. You need 4 quadrants. So we'll call the top side the academics, because so often they're elitists and want to be on top. The bottom half we'll put people who are not that. I don't know. I mean, there's plenty of people, like we talked about earlier, who they might not have letters after their name or be introduced as Dr. Smith or Dr. Jones, but they're every bit as smart as. I mean, look, Richard Swinburne, who is without question one of the most brilliant philosophical theologians ever, who's still alive, does not have a PhD. Okay, like, you don't have to be a PhD in order to be a rock star super genius. Paul Helm does not have a PhD, right? John Frame does not have a PhD. And there's, I don't know, but I promise you there are really, really brilliant atheists out there who don't have PhDs too. So you've got your elites that you could divide up into theists and atheists, and then you have your non-academics who you could also divide up into theists and non-theists. And the problem that you're describing here, I do think it's a real problem. Okay, there's people who really care about the arguments, and there's people who just want to tug at heartstrings, or they want to yell and scream, and or they want to show off, and they want to say, look how smart I am, and I can talk so fast that nobody can keep up with my argument, and therefore I look like I'm the one who actually knows what he's talking about. And I just want to say that problem exists in all four of those quadrants that we just drew. Okay, this is not unique to theists or atheists, and it is also not unique to academics or non-academics. Now, I will grant you that academic philosophers, at least the ones who are trained to pay attention to arguments and think through things logically, and let's get clear on our definitions so we're not talking past each other, they don't tend to do this in the same way that what you called the internet atheists do. But don't mistakenly think that it doesn't happen even there, right? Because it does. And it's not fair to lay this problem at the feet of the internet atheists and say that they're the ones who do it, and pretend that the internet theist or the, keyboard apologists don't do the same things themselves, because this is a problem that's everywhere. And I don't necessarily know what the solution is, but I'll tell you one thing that has really helped me. If you believe that you are the smartest person in the room, it's probably a good idea to go find a different room. Not to say that you can never be the person who's helping other people learn, but we're never done learning. We've never got it all figured out. And it's a good idea to go and find people who are smarter and know more than you, and sit at their feet and listen and learn and grow. And we don't like to do that a lot. It's not natural to us. Humility doesn't just grow on trees. And I'm not a humble person. I'm proud, and I'm not trying to hold myself up as the model of how to do this right. But there are brilliant, brilliant people in the world, and we should take every advantage of having the opportunity to spend time with those people as we can and learn from them. A lot of times we don't, because it's more important to us that we win the argument rather than pursue truth. So if you understand yourself to be just trying to get at the truth, whatever the truth is, then there's no need to be a troll about it, which is not to say, on my view, that there's no reason to ever have a sharp word or something. You can't read 2 pages of the New Testament without seeing Paul or John or Jesus having some very strong language come out of their mouth. So I'm not saying that there can't be that, but I guess it's just a good idea to set as a ground rule, again, analytic philosophy to the rescue, at the forefront of the debate. What are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to get at the truth? Okay, cool. You're trying to get at the truth. I'm trying to get at the truth. Let's do that together. Even though we disagree, we're trying to get to the truth. But if it's instead, hey, what are we trying to do? I'm trying to win. I want to win this argument. I want to make you look stupid, and I want to show myself off to be super smart. Okay, well, I'll let you do that all by yourself, because I really have no interest in doing that. And that happens amongst academics. There are plenty of academic conferences that you can go to that are just these sessions of opportunities for people to show off how smart they are, and that's what they care about. And that's, ain't nobody got time for that. So
Sure. So let me just clarify here real quick, because I agree with you. But whenever I'm talking about, like, for example, earlier I said something about someone who didn't even finish a college degree. I'm partially talking about myself there, because I'm just now going back to finish my Associates of Science. So yeah, you can talk about it when you're there. So
so you're picking up your own. Okay, that's fair.
Yes, exactly. So I just wanted to qualify that, and then agree with you that, a lot of people think because you're a Christian, you can't say anything negative, or like you can't have a sharp word here or there. And I think, like, I like William Lane Craig. He said something one time, and a student tried to call him out on it and said, "Man, you said that this guy was this and that, and that's an ad hominem. And he said, no, it's not an ad hominem. An ad hominem is when you say he is dishonest, and that's why his position is wrong. But me just saying that he's dishonest is at most impolite, and I think that was a good point, is that, are you saying these things to try to avoid his argument, or are you just saying what you believe to be the case? And although we should try and limit saying those type of things, sometimes it is necessary. And um, you know, I'm just happy for people who are willing to come on and have the discussion. So
Yeah, I'll just say this. I've said it. I want to be more like Jesus. Okay. I understand that this whole thing that I'm experiencing, and that all Christians are in the process of becoming more like Jesus. The way the Apostle Paul said it, we're predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son, right? So we're on this journey of becoming more and more Christ-like. Well, what does it mean to be Christ-like? Jesus called people names. He insulted people. He went after them. He corrected them. He rebuked them. And he loved. He also said, let the little children come. And he went out of his way to heal the sick and be merciful. So it's a both and here. But there are lots of people who want to be like Jesus, and what they actually say, I want to be like Jesus, and what they're actually trying to do, the person who they're trying to become doesn't look a lot like Jesus. I mean, if you can live your entire life and never call someone a name, you're not like Jesus. You're just not. That's not what Jesus did. So we should really familiarize ourselves with who Jesus was. I think we should all it would be good if we just read through the 4 Gospels. Might take a couple of days of not reading your analytic philosophy of metaphysics of modality or proper understandings of causation. But if you want to be like Jesus, I was interviewed and asked by a ministry one time who went out and asked several Christian apologists, what are the top 3 apologetics books you should read? And they went out and got really important people, Peter Van Inwagen and William Lane Craig, and people that responded to the survey. And for some reason, my name got included in this. I'm very disappointed to say that of all the people who were asked, I was the only person who said you should read the Bible. That's the most important apologetics book you can read, because you cannot defend the faith if you do not know the faith. It's not possible. You cannot share the faith unless you know the faith, and you really can't grow in the faith. And so we should, I don't know, if we want to be like Jesus, let's read the Bible. Let's read the Gospels in particular.
Yeah.
So
well, that's actually really refreshing to hear you to hear you say that. But while we're on that topic, what are a couple of books that you would, given the Bible, but
Okay.
what are a couple of books that you would suggest to people? I like C.S. Lewis, for example.
Yeah. So C.S. Lewis been,
and I like the more technical as well, like Dr. Michael Heiser and people like that. But what are something that you would suggest to people?
Well, so this is a hard question for me because, there's just general books of recommending. I read Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, a long time ago. That was maybe my first dipping my toe into apologetics. And if I remember, I read that probably the summer of 2000. I think that's right. So I would, looking back on it, I wouldn't even understand myself to have been born again at the time. Yeah, so I think that's a helpful book. My friend Greg Gansel wrote a book called Thinking About God, First Steps in Philosophy of Religion, that I think is a really helpful, introductory, very accessible book. Mm-hmm. I would want to ask questions to people well, what are you interested in? And
right, what specifically?
What are you wrestling with? What's God doing in your life right now? And then make recommendations kind of along those lines. Like here's a good, for instance, Tom Morris wrote a book called Our Idea of God that I think is a really helpful introduction to thinking philosophically about the divine nature. But it's super introductory. And if you are already familiar with a lot of these categories, then you should go get his book and Sell Me in Explorations. And it's a lot more technical and a lot more fun if you are interested in this kind of stuff. But I couldn't recommend that to somebody who hadn't already spent some time swimming in the swimming pool that is philosophical theology. So
right. It's like you're reading Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and then you try to read Maps of Meaning. It's it's a much more tedious and technical, specialized book there. So I guess that'll do it for the questions that I had. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I just want to ask you those, and then you can answer them as long or short as you want. And so you talked about taking a break from modality and these things to read the Bible, but listen, one of the questions is actually about that. So earlier on, Tom Jump was in the room here. I invited him, and he actually left you a question. He asked, under modal logic, can you believe it's possible God exists, and also believe it's possible God does not exist? And if you want to, for the audience, just like make them familiar with modal logic, I guess it's something like qualifying the truth of a statement. If you want to put it in a better way than that, and then answer the question, just a brief overview.
Yeah, so I want to be super technical and as precise as I know how to be with this question. Let's first talk about what modality is, right? Modality and the metaphysics of modality is a way of understanding how things exist, and not how in terms of like cause, why this exists, but there are different ways that something can exist. Something can exist necessarily where it couldn't fail to exist, or something could exist contingently where it exists, but it doesn't have to exist. And there are other things that we think are impossible, like they cannot exist. One kind of obvious thing would be like things that would entail a contradiction. Someone who is a married bachelor. Well, if you're married, you're not a bachelor. If you're a bachelor, you're not married. So we kind of think it's not possible for someone to exist who is a married bachelor because it's a contradiction. So we say married bachelors are impossible. So modality and thinking about modality is a way of thinking about possibility and necessity or impossibility, contingency, all of these ideas. Those are fun things to think about if you like solving puzzles, and it's really boring if you don't like to think about those kind of things. I do, because I'm just a nerd. So the question is, let's see if can you believe on modal logic that God possibly exists and God possibly does not exist? Is that
yes. Under modal logic, can you believe it's possible God exists and also believe it possible God does not exist?
Okay, so this question doesn't make sense to me for several reasons. First of all, under modal logic. Well, which modal logic? There are different understandings of what modal logic is. This is something I was trying to explain to Tom the last time we were visiting, that like some people accept certain rules in modal logic and some people do not accept those same rules. And there's a debate, for instance, about S5, where he was saying when I debated him last that he rejected S5. Okay, so that would be a different understanding of modal logic than the one that I have. So then you have this question, under which modal logic can you do this or can you do this? And then the question is also strange because he seems to think that there's just this just one thing, modal logic. So maybe he's trying to ask, under my system of modal logic, under the way that I understand this, can you believe that God possibly exists and that God possibly does not exist? Now, I guess, can you believe, like, is it possible that somebody does this? I think, of course, but he probably means, can someone rationally believe this and that at the same time, like without a contradiction? And I would say that under the way that I understand modal logic, no, you couldn't believe that God possibly exists and that God possibly does not exist at the same time under the rules of modal logic that I want to appropriate in my system. And by the way, those rules are not like unique to, I don't have some strange, crazy view of modal logic. I'm right there with Alex Bruce and Josh Rasmussen, their defenses of modal logic in their recent book, Necessary Existence. I completely agree with their brilliant defenses. Some of the hardest logic I've ever worked through, but I'm very thankful for Alex and Josh and their hard work. So
interesting.
So if somebody doesn't want to buy into my views on modal logic, I want to know where they disagree with Alex and Josh. And if they can show me where Alex and Josh have gone wrong, then I'm really interested. If they can't, then I think that they're kind of cherry picking.
Okay.
But anyway, having really tried to understand the nature of the question under modal logic, which one? Okay, the one that I've used. Can someone believe? Yes, they can. Oh, but can they rationally believe? Can they coherently believe? No. Under modal logic, as I understand it, it would be irrational for a person to believe that God possibly exists and that God possibly does not exist at the same time. That would be irrational, because God, at least if we're talking about the God that I believe in, and I think the God that you believe in, and the God that William Lane Craig believes in, or the God that Alvin Plantinga believes in, the God that St. Anselm believed in, we're talking about a God who exists of necessity, not a God who it just so happens that God exists, or a God that God exists in this world, but there are other worlds and God does not exist in those other worlds. The whole idea of God that we're talking about is the biggest, the most humongous, the most awesome, the greatest possible being. God has more awesome points than any of the other beings, than any of the other possible beings. And when we think about God's existence, and we think about how existence might contribute to a being's awesomeness or a being's greatness, you can ask yourself, like, well, which would be better? A being that exists contingently, meaning that this being exists in some possible worlds but does not exist in other possible worlds? Or would it be more awesome if a being existed not just in some worlds, but in all of the worlds? And my intuitions lead me to obviously conclude that obviously it's superior to exist in all possible worlds than in only some worlds. Well, if you think that God is the greatest possible being, then it's obvious that God would exist in all possible worlds. And if you're thinking about a God and you go, well, maybe I don't think about that God, maybe I'm thinking about a God who only exists in some worlds, then I kind of want to say my God can beat up your God, because my God exists in all possible worlds and therefore is obviously better. Now, those are my intuitions that lead me, and I would be very interested in hearing why other people's intuitions would lead them away from God existing as a necessary being. And there are philosophers who don't think that, right? Richard Swinburne and I have gone round and round about this. Bill Hasker and I have gone round and round about this. And Tom Senor and I have gone round and round about this. Now, Tom's view is by far the most interesting. This is Tom Senor on this question, because he thinks that there's only one possible world in which God does not exist, and that's the world that's an empty set. Just there's nothing in it. And I disagree, because I think God's a necessary being, but Tom's at least thought about this a lot. Okay, so with all that, with this understanding of like God being the greatest being, well, the greatest being is going to exist in all possible worlds. So if that's the definition of God that we're using, and we're doing our analytic philosophy and trying to get clear and define our terms right from the get-go, then it doesn't make sense to think that God possibly exists and that God possibly does not exist. Because if you think that God possibly exists, what you're saying is, I think that there is one possible world, there is at least one possible world, and in that world, the greatest possible being exists. Now, if you believe that, it follows from that God exists in all possible worlds. Now, let's take the antithesis of that. If you believe that there is a possible world where God does not exist, so according to Tom Jump's question, under modal logic, could you believe that there's a possible world in which God exists and that there's a possible world where God does not exist? Well, if there's a possible world where God does not exist, then that means that there is at least one world in which God does not exist. But if God exists at all, by definition, ex hypothesi, he exists in all possible worlds. So if you think that there's one possible world where God does not exist, then God does not exist at all. Now, I don't think that there are any possible worlds where God does not exist. I do think that God exists in all possible worlds. I tend to think that there's only one possible world that actually exists as a concrete realm, like the one that we described. I am not somebody who subscribes to the idea that there are multiple possible worlds that are real, in where real means concrete, where you would be thinking about possible worlds sometimes in the way that science fiction people want us to think about parallel universes. It's not the same comparison, and I don't like it when people try to make that comparison, because there are important philosophical differences there.
Is that modal concretism or something?
Yeah, so there's the debate about modal actualism versus modal concretism, modal realism. All of those debates come into play here. So David Lewis sort of famously believed that all possible worlds actually exist, like really, in the same way that this world exists, all possible worlds exist.
Well, that's interesting.
I don't buy that.
Well, it's a good segue, because our last question is from Praise I Am That I Am. He'll be familiar to a lot of people. His question, my question to Ben, is about the ontological argument. So it's a great segue. Does God being maximally great only have to be valid in one world or all possible worlds? And can the ontological argument be non-modal?
Okay, let's take these questions in reverse order. Can the ontological argument be non-modal? Absolutely, yes.
Anselm's argument was non-modal.
That's right. Yeah. So Anselm's argument was not a modal ontological argument. Rene Descartes' ontological argument, I don't think, was a modal ontological argument. There's a kind of ontological argument that Benedict Spinoza gives us, and it's not a modal ontological argument. So yes, there are, and one of the things to understand about the ontological argument is that it's probably not right to call it the ontological argument. There are lots of different ontological arguments for the existence of God. Some of them are good and some of them are not good. Anselm's ontological argument is definitely not a modal ontological argument. So yeah, there's a simple answer to that question.
Okay, and how about
there are non-modal?
Okay, and how about, does God being maximally great only have to be valid in one world or in all possible worlds?
Yeah, so I do think that the existence of, let's say it this way, the nature of the divine being, I think, is constant across all possible worlds. And here's why I think that. Let's just think about two possible worlds for right now. We're gonna talk about the actual world where we think God exists and is maximally great, and we're going to talk about some other possible world that's next door. And in that world, God is not maximally great, but he's like almost maximally great. Maybe he's super, super powerful, but not quite omnipotent. in the possible world next door. Well, I don't think that those are the same being. I actually think that those are two different beings. So it doesn't make sense to say that it's God in both of those. It makes sense to say that it's God where God is maximally great, and then you have Schmod instead of God, or in the other one. And part of the reason I think that, it has to do with what's called essentialism about these great-making attributes. Like, think about love as an attribute, and maximal love we'll call omnibenevolence or moral perfection, right? Would it be better to be morally perfect just kind of accidentally so, where it just so happens that I am morally perfect? Or would it be better from the standpoint of great perfect being theology or maximal greatness, if the being that was morally perfect didn't just so happen to be morally perfect, but could not fail to be morally perfect? So it's not just that the being is morally perfect in this world, but that it's morally perfect in all worlds and could never cease to be morally perfect. My intuitions lead me to think that that's obviously superior. So that would mean that God has the attribute of moral perfection, not contingently, but essentially. And if that's an essential component of the divine nature, then it follows that in all worlds in which God exists, God is morally perfect. And if moral perfection is part of what leads us to believe that God is maximally great, and when I say part of that, I mean that evidentially, not ontologically, because I don't think God has parts. But if we think that God is maximally great, and one of the reasons why we think God is maximally great is because God is morally perfect, then when you start thinking about these things across possible worlds, we start to realize that in all the worlds in which God exists, God is going to be maximally great. And in any worlds in which God is less than maximally great, well, turns out that being is not God. So,
Okay. Well, I really appreciate that. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we go?
Yeah, two things, just real quick. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. That changes everything. It's a big deal. It's not just a story that we tell to make ourselves feel better. It actually happened in time, in space, in real history. When I say George Washington was the first president of the United States, that's a true statement. When I say Jesus Christ rose from the dead, true statement. Should be interpreted in the same way. Second thing, a little bit less important, but some people don't know, Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself.
That's hilarious. That's perfect. Perfect. Great way to end this stream here. I've got so many more questions, Ben, but we'll have to do this again. And I'd like to see you have some discussions with some people that are online that are very bright and intelligent people that do not share our beliefs. And I'd like to have some more discussions with you. I've got so many more questions, but if you'd be open to that, and I really appreciate you coming on, Ben.
Yeah, well, I'd love the opportunity to keep chatting, and especially learning from other people who are smart. This is never something that anybody has to twist my arm to do, because if I wasn't sitting here talking about philosophy and theology with you, I'd be doing it with somebody else. So thanks again for the opportunity. This is really fun.
That's very humble of you, and it's really charitable for you to take your time and do this. So I know you just got out of the office, and I'm sure your wife wants to see you and your kids. So again, I appreciate it, Ben, and let's do it again soon.
Cool. All right. Talk to you later.